How's it going, guys? Today I got a really cool project to show you. It's a large end grain barbecue board with some epoxy inlay. I go through my process on it, some tips and tricks I learned along the way, and well, I even show you guys some of my mistakes. So hopefully you guys can learn from them. Let's get into this. So here's a fairly large piece of 1/4 walnut I'm bringing over to my miter saw. It's a bit heavy. I chop these down to length for my first glue up, and then I'll also rip them later just so they can fit on the joint. These cuts don't have to be perfect, they're just getting them down to a rough size. And you'll also see there's a strip of maple in there as well. A fairly new upgrade to my shop was this Laguna Fusion 2 table saw. I'm extremely happy with it so far. It's got the 1 3/4 horse motor. You don't see it on camera, but I actually did stall the motor on this table saw. It was a fine line between burning the wood and being able to push the wood through consistently without the motor bogging down. So with the joiners set up, I went ahead and jointed one face and one edge of each board. After that, I took the face jointed side of the board, put that down, and ran them all through the planer until they were all the same size. Now be honest, how many hours of video do you think you guys watch of lumber being milled? I'll try and keep it short. Now I take those milled boards and run them through the table saw. I did 1 3/4 strips. This should give me fairly equally sized end grain blocks when the board is all done. Some of these though, not quite up to par. You can see this one had a check through it, and you can actually hear my finger tapping on it, how hollow it is. So with everything cut to size, it's now time to kind of orient it in a way you see fit. A good idea is to alternate which way the end grain is going on each board. This will keep it from warping in one direction later down the road. Okay, now that I'm back from the store with some glue. Oh, and by the way, just buy the big glue bottle and be done with it. With the clamps all set up, it's time to slather these in glue. I went ahead and grabbed one of those cheap $1 paint brushes because I thought it would be easier to spread the glue. And while it was, those hairs from the cheap brushes kind of came off everywhere and I had to pick them out, so I do not recommend using one of those. I work my way through all the clamps, making sure they consistently have even pressure. And that's all the big clamps I have, so it's gonna have to do. Quick tip too, instead of trying to scrape the glue off later, just take a damp rag and wipe the whole thing down. It makes it so much easier. Then you can go through and kind of clean up some high spots of glue. With the glue dried overnight, I can take it out of the clamps and check over everything, make sure it all looks good. Get some of that glue squeeze cleaned up, and it's ready to go on the CNC machine for flattening. So this is the Onefinity Woodworker, and it has a cut area of 32 inches. My glue up is around 38 inches long. So you can see, in your head, you're probably like, no, that's not gonna work. It did work, but I'm going to let you know later why I wouldn't do it this way again. My method for flattening anything on the CNC machine is to first take a pair of calipers, find the highest spot on the board, mark that measurement down, and then find the lowest spot on the board. And you're only going to be able to do this on the corners, obviously. Subtract those two, and you can input that into your software as your first pass, and that should get you very, very close. The bit I'm using is just a white side 1-inch spoil board surfacing bit, and it works incredibly well. So my theory was, if the board's not too wonky, I should be able to just slide it back and the uncut area, bring that into the bed on the CNC machine, run the same file again, and it should come out extremely close. And you can see with one side of the board flattened, it actually worked. I really had my doubts about this, but you know what? If it works, it works. At the moment, I did think of another option to do this, and this is the way I would recommend doing it. Basically, take that whole board, if it's bigger than your machine bed, cut it in half. You're gonna cross-cut it anyway later on, so cut it into 2 smaller pieces. You can flatten them both to the same thickness, and voila. That would just be a lot simpler. Which brings me to the biggest mistake on this whole project that I made. You can see here, there's a check up one of these boards. It almost runs the whole length, and you'll see later it did run the whole length. I thought, well, I'll just, fill it with some epoxy. It probably isn't that deep. Everything will be fine. Well, not so much. But I still want to run through the process with you guys so you understand how these boards are built. So I set up my crosscut sled for 1 3/4 strips, ripped a fresh edge on one side, and then went through and got as many strips out of this as I could. You will then flip these on their ends so the end grain is facing up. Looks really good so far, doesn't it? Just wait. It's coming. That check you saw on the board earlier was so bad, this thing just snapped like a toothpick in my hand. I was beyond myself. I could not believe it. So I went ahead and gave myself a little rest from this project and got back out the next day and restarted this whole thing. But since you guys have already seen me build one up to this point, I'm going to skip over that and we're going to start off right where we left off. Almost like this never happened. For me, I found if you apply the glue to a lot of the pieces, if not the majority of what you're gluing up, it makes it a lot faster once you start laying everything in place, because for something this big, you really do have to move kind of quick. It doesn't set up super fast, but you definitely don't want to be lagging, especially if you have different designs or boards you want to line up perfectly. I proceeded with the same surfacing process as before, so I'm going to skip over that and let's go into the V-carve and show you guys this cool design I found. It's a tiki head, but you already knew that. So you can see here, I'm doing the V-carve toolpath first before the clearing. In my experience, it just comes out a cleaner finish. And if you're curious, I set the toolpath to do a flat depth of 0.1. For my resin, I went with the Total Boat High Performance Epoxy and mixed in some black diamond mica powder for color. The process of pouring the resin is pretty simple. Make sure your piece is perfectly level, make sure your resin's thoroughly mixed, and go ahead and pour. Use a torch to pop any air bubbles you see coming up, and then I gave it a full 24 hours before I came back and flattened it. So you're probably wondering in the last minute or so, why is there a juice groove in the board all of a sudden? He never mentioned that. Well, I kind of made a mistake and I got ahead of myself and wanted to cut the juice groove, but I figured out after I flattened the epoxy, it ruined the juice groove and I had to recut it. And to kind of top it off, since this board is so big, I went ahead and designed some little handles and cut those out as well. Okay, so sanding. Start at 80 grit, 120, 150, 180, water pop it, final sand to 220, and then we apply Odie's oil. Don't forget about that like and subscribe button. I enjoy making this content. I appreciate your guys' feedback. Here's to the next one. See you soon.